Snow fell softly over Moscow like falling ash from a silent sky, each flake drifting without urgency, as if even winter itself had paused to listen. The cathedral stood in the center of it all, ancient and unyielding, its painted domes glowing faintly beneath the pale streetlights. Inside, the air was warmer but heavier, thick with anticipation and something unnamed. Candles flickered in trembling rows, their flames dancing like nervous hearts. The vast ceiling rose high above, curved and painted with saints who had watched centuries of sorrow and joy pass beneath them. Their faded eyes seemed alive tonight. The audience filled every wooden pew. Some had come out of curiosity. Others came because they believed they might witness something rare, something real. Near the front, Simon Cowell sat quietly, his usual confidence softened into something more reserved. His hands were folded, his face unreadable. He had heard thousands of voices in his life. Voices that soared, voices that failed, voices that pretended to be something they weren't. But tonight, he felt something different. He didn't know why. The doors at the back creaked open. A small figure stepped inside. He was thin, his coat too light for the Russian winter. His shoes looked worn, the soles uneven. His dark hair framed a face that carried too much understanding for someone so young. His name was Matteo. He had traveled farther than anyone in that cathedral knew. Farther than distance, farther than comfort, farther than fear. He walked slowly down the aisle, his footsteps echoing in the cathedral's vast body. Each step sounded louder than it should have, like the building itself was listening. Some people glanced at him with polite interest. Others barely noticed, but Simon watched him carefully. There was something in the boy's eyes. Not nervousness, not arrogance, something deeper, something quieter, something broken, and somehow whole at the same time. Matteo stopped beneath the center dome. The lights above him glowed softly. He looked small, too small. The microphone stood in front of him like a question. He reached for it with trembling fingers. His breath caught. For a moment, he said nothing. And in that silence, memories returned. Not to the audience, not to Simon, but to Matteo. He remembered the narrow streets of Manila, where Christmas lights hung between broken buildings like fragile promises. He remembered the smell of smoke and salt in the air. He remembered singing on corners where people passed without seeing him. He remembered his mother's voice most of all. Soft, warm, fading. She had loved Christmas, even when they had nothing. Even when the world had taken more than it had given. She would sing while cooking rice. She would sing while watching the rain. She would sing even when her voice trembled with pain she tried to hide. And Matteo would listen. He would listen like the sound itself was food. Like it could fill the emptiness inside him. But illness came quietly, and took her slowly, until the house became silent. Until Christmas became something else. Something heavier, something colder. Matteo blinked, and the cathedral returned. The microphone stood waiting. The audience shifted. Simon leaned forward slightly. Matteo closed his eyes. He opened his mouth. The first note came out fragile. Barely more than a whisper. But it was pure. It floated into the air like breath on cold glass. The cathedral caught it, held it, carried it. The note grew stronger, warmer. And suddenly, Matteo was not standing in Moscow. He was standing in Manila again. Standing beside his mother. Standing beside the last Christmas they shared. His voice trembled, but it did not break. It carried something heavier than technique. It carried truth. Each word he sang was not performed. It was remembered. The sound rose higher, filling the vast cathedral until it seemed impossible that such a small body could contain it. The audience stilled. A woman in the second row felt tears gather without understanding why. An old man lowered his head. A young girl reached for her father's hand. Simon's chest tightened. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He simply listened. Matteo sang of longing, of love that refused to disappear, of nights spent hoping for one more moment that would never come. His voice cracked slightly, and in that crack, something extraordinary happened. It became more human, more real, more alive. The cathedral walls, built to carry centuries of prayer, now carried his grief. His hope, his memory. The final verse came softer, almost fragile, like something that could disappear if touched too harshly. Matteo's eyes opened. They glistened beneath the lights. He was no longer in Manila. He was no longer beside his mother. He was here, alone, And yet not alone at all. His voice fell into silence. The last note lingered. It hovered in the air, refusing to leave. And then, nothing. Silence filled the cathedral. Not empty silence. Sacred silence. No one moved. No one breathed. It felt wrong to break it. Simon realized his vision had blurred. He blinked. A tear fell before he could stop it. He didn't wipe it away. He didn't care who saw. Because for the first time in years, he had not listened as a judge. He had listened as a human being. Matteo lowered his head. He thought of his mother again. He wondered if she would have been proud. He wondered if she had heard him. He wondered if somewhere, somehow, she knew. A single clap echoed, then another, until the cathedral filled with sound once more. But this time, it was not Matteo singing. It was the audience, standing, clapping, crying, honoring something they could not name. Simon stood slowly. His hands came together, not as a judge, not as a critic, but as someone who had just witnessed truth. Matteo looked up, surprised. He had sung before crowds. He had sung on streets. But never like this, never where people looked at him as if he mattered. Simon stepped forward. His voice, when he spoke, was quieter than anyone expected. "I've heard voices my entire life," he said. "But what you gave tonight wasn't just a voice." He paused. Emotion caught in his throat. It was a memory, and somehow, you let all of us share it. Matteo didn't know what to say. He simply nodded, because words felt too small. Outside, the snow continued to fall. But inside, something had changed. Not just in Matteo, not just in Simon, but in everyone who had been there. Because sometimes, music did more than entertain. Sometimes, it reminded people of who they had been, of who they had lost, of who they still loved. Matteo stepped away from the microphone. His hands still trembled, but his heart felt lighter. For the first time since his mother's death, the silence inside him was not empty. It was peaceful. Simon watched him go. He knew this moment would stay with him. Long after the cathedral emptied. Long after the snow melted. Long after the world moved on. Because some voices did not fade. Some voices became part of you. Matteo reached the doors. He paused. He looked back once more. The candles flickered. The vast ceiling watched. The space that had held his grief now held his healing. He stepped outside. The cold air met his face. Snow touched his skin. He breathed in deeply. For the first time in a long time, he did not feel alone. Far away, beneath the same sky, Christmas lights would soon glow in Manila. And somewhere beyond sight, beyond sound, beyond distance, a mother's love listened, and smiled. But the night was not finished. Simon remained inside the cathedral. Long after the audience had left, the echoes of Matteo's voice lingered in his mind, replaying not as sound, but as feeling. He sat alone in the wooden pew, staring at the place where the boy had stood. He had seen talent before. He had seen perfection, but perfection never stayed with him like this. Perfection impressed. This had hurt, and somehow, that made it more beautiful. He remembered the moment Matteo's voice cracked. That fragile imperfection had carried more meaning than any flawless note ever could. It was honest, and honesty was rare. Simon stood slowly and walked toward the center of the cathedral. His footsteps echoed, but they felt smaller now, humbled by what they had witnessed. He imagined the boy singing alone on the streets of Manila. Cars passing, people ignoring him, cold nights, empty pockets, empty space beside him where his mother should have been. Simon understood something now. Music had not saved Matteo. Matteo had saved the music. Because he had given it truth. Outside, Matteo stood beneath the falling snow. He held his thin coat closer around his body, but he barely felt the cold. Inside him, something warm had begun to grow. Not joy, not yet, but something close, something possible. He remembered the last Christmas with his mother. She had been too weak to stand, too weak to sing, so he had sung for her. His small voice trembling. She had smiled anyway, and when he finished, she had whispered something he never forgot. "Your voice is not yours," she had said softly. "It belongs to the people who need it." At the time, he hadn't understood. He thought she meant audiences, crowds, applause. But now he knew. She meant the broken, the lonely, the ones carrying silence inside them. He turned his face toward the sky. Snowflakes landed on his eyelashes. He didn't wipe them away. He let them stay. Behind him, the cathedral doors opened. Simon stepped outside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They simply stood there. Two lives from different worlds, connected by something neither could fully explain. Simon finally said, "Why did you choose that song?" Matteo hesitated. He looked down at his hands. "It was her favorite," he said quietly. Simon nodded. He understood. Not as a judge, but as a son. Not every loss could be spoken. Some losses could only be sung. Simon placed a gentle hand on Matteo's shoulder. It was not a gesture of authority. It was a gesture of respect. "You didn't just sing tonight," Simon said. "You reminded people of what they still carry." Matteo swallowed. He had never thought of it that way. He had only sung because he missed her. Simon removed his hand and stepped back. He knew this moment didn't belong to him. It belonged to the boy. It belonged to the voice. Matteo looked at the cathedral one last time. It no longer felt like a place of strangers. It felt like a place that had listened. He turned and began walking into the snowy night. Each step carried him forward. Not away from his past, but with it, because grief did not disappear. It transformed. It became part of the voice. Part of the strength. Part of the song. Simon watched until the boy disappeared into the falling snow. He didn't know what Matteo's future would be. Fame, success, or something quieter. But he knew one thing with certainty. The world would hear him. Not because he was perfect, but because he was real. Inside the cathedral, the candles continued to burn. Their flames steady, their light gentle, and somewhere, carried in memory and air and heart, a Filipino Christmas song still echoed. Not in sound, but in souls, and it would echo there forever.